Imagine sitting quietly in a park you've called home for over 30 years, only to be approached by a young officer who demands to know if you belong there. How would you react if your peaceful morning turned into a confrontation rooted in nothing more than your appearance? And what happens when the officer learns the truth about the man he's trying to intimidate? This is a story of justice, karma, and a powerful revelation that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us to see how one quiet moment set off a chain reaction that changed everything. Before we jump into today's story drop, where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet city of Trenton, Tennessee. The early morning light spilled through the branches of the tall oaks, casting long shadows across Grant Park. It was the kind of morning that made you stop and savor the peacefulness, a rarity in these times. On an old wooden bench close to the center, I heard an elderly man, a long-time resident of this neighborhood, being harassed for sitting in a public park. That's what I heard. Clark's face flushed with anger. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His authority, already fragile, was being openly questioned by two men who didn't seem the least bit intimidated by his uniform or his threats. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Kelvin. "You need to watch your tone," Clark growled. "This is official business." Kelvin didn't budge. He met the officer's glare with a level gaze of his own. "I'm not watching anything except you," Kelvin replied. "And what I see is a man overstepping his authority." Raymond, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Kelvin," he said quietly, "it's all right. I don't want any trouble." Kelvin glanced back at Raymond, his face softening for a moment. "This isn't trouble, Ray. It's about standing up for what's right." Officer Clark took another step forward. Discussions these had all been tried before, but they also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. "We've got to show up," Kelvin said, his voice firm. "They need to see that we won't be silent anymore. We demand accountability. We demand better." The crowd began to buzz with conversation, energy crackling through the air. People began to talk about organizing a rally, contacting city officials, demanding answers. Some of them had been involved in community organizing before, but others were new to this kind of action. Their passion born out of frustration with the system. As the crowd swelled with purpose, Raymond couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had been tired, was still tired, but seeing the faces of the younger generation stepping up to carry the torch gave him a new sense of strength. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Kelvin placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, as if sensing the shift in his mood. "We're not doing this alone, Ray," he said quietly. "Look around." "I didn't think I'd make a difference." Raymond shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. Every person in this fight makes a difference. You're just as important as anyone else standing up. Don't doubt that for a moment." They sat in silence, the park coming alive around them as people started their morning walks, jogs, and daily routines. Anita stayed beside him, her posture relaxing slightly as she realized that she didn't need to have all the answers to be part of something bigger than herself. "I want to help," she said after a long pause, "but I don't know where to start." Raymond chuckled softly. "No one knows where to start. We all just figure it out along the way." Meanwhile, across town, Kelvin had been hard at work with the core group of community leaders, hammering out details for their next major step. A public forum with city officials, police representatives, and concerned citizens. They wanted transparency, real accountability. They wanted to make sure that the promises they were. Imagine sitting quietly in a park you've called home for over 30 years, only to be approached by a young officer who demands to know if you belong there. How would you react if your peaceful morning turned into a confrontation rooted in nothing more than your appearance? And what happens when the officer learns the truth about the man he's trying to intimidate? This is a story of justice, karma, and a powerful revelation that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us to see how one quiet moment set off a chain reaction that changed everything. Before we jump into This is a story of justice, karma, and a powerful revelation that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us to see how one quiet moment set off a chain reaction. Today's story drop, where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet city of Trenton, Tennessee. The early morning light spilled through the branches of the tall oaks, casting long shadows across Grant Park. It was the kind of morning that made you stop and savor the peacefulness, a rarity in these times. On an old wooden bench close to the center of the park sat an elderly man, Raymond Brooks. His hands, rough and weathered from years of hard work, held a warm cup of coffee. At the officer's face, Clark's expression was unreadable, but his stance had shifted slightly, and Raymond could see the officer's fingers twitching near his holster. "ID," Raymond repeated, his voice steady but now tinged with disbelief. "I'm not sure why I'd need that. I'm just sitting here minding my own business." Clark's lips thinned. "I need to verify that you belong in this neighborhood," he said, his voice growing firmer, more authoritative. "We've had some issues lately." Raymond's jaw clenched. He felt that old, familiar frustration rising in his chest. The frustration that had simmered for years, often buried, but never gone. He had lived through segregation, through decades of being told where he could and couldn't go, and here it was again in 2024, in his own neighborhood, in a park that he had helped protect and preserve. But this time, Raymond wasn't a young man anymore. He wasn't filled with the same fight that had once burned so brightly in his heart. Now it was exhaustion more than anything else. Officer Raymond said slowly, his voice still calm despite the growing tension, "I've been sitting on this bench long before you were even born." "I don't think I need to prove anything." For a brief moment, Clark looked almost startled, but then his expression hardened. He stepped closer, his hand now resting openly on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to show me some identification." Now the confrontation was drawing attention. A few passers-by slowed their pace, watching the exchange with growing concern. But no one stepped forward to intervene. Not yet. Raymond slowly reached for his cane, which leaned against the bench beside him. He used it to stand, the years weighing heavily on his legs. He wasn't in the mood to argue, but he wasn't about to let this officer push him around either. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said quietly, meeting Clark's eyes. "But I'm not about to let you treat me like a criminal for sitting in a park." The air between them grew thick with tension, each man standing his ground. Officer Clark, young and inexperienced, felt his authority being questioned, his control slipping away. Raymond, tired but resolute, wasn't backing down. It was then that someone else entered the scene from behind a row of tall hedges. A figure emerged, quietly, unnoticed at first by both men. Kelvin Williams, a retired schoolteacher in his early 60s, had been sitting nearby on a bench under the shade of a tree. He had come to Grant Park for the same reason as Raymond: peace and quiet, a chance to reflect and escape the noise of the world. He had noticed the officer when he first entered the park, but like Raymond, thought little of it at first. That changed when he overheard the officer's voice grow sharper and more aggressive. The sight of Officer Clark standing inches from Raymond, with his hand too close. Cue his weapon for comfort sent a chill down Kelvin's spine. He knew exactly where this was heading, and it wasn't going to end well if someone didn't step in. Kelvin rose from his bench, moving swiftly but with the quiet grace that years of teaching had given him. He was tall and broad-shouldered with greying hair and a calm, steady demeanour. His footsteps were soft on the gravel as he approached the scene. As Kelvin came into view, Raymond noticed him first. A look of relief flickered across his face, though his body remained tense. Officer Clark, however, was too focused on Raymond to notice the newcomer right away. Sir Clark said, his voice low and threatening, "Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Show me your ID, or I'll have no choice but to escort you out of this park." Raymond didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze with the quiet strength that came from decades of enduring this kind of treatment. "I don't have to go anywhere," he replied, his voice steady. "I have every right to be here." It was then that Kelvin stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the asked in Spanish, his voice rough from years of smoke and violence. Boone nodded. Once the man studied him for a beat, then smirked. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here." Boone smirked right back. "I hear that a lot." The man chuckled, motioning toward the SUV. "Get in. We don't talk out here." Boone slid into the passenger seat without hesitation. The man climbed in behind the wheel, starting the engine with a smooth turn of the key. The moment they pulled onto the narrow jungle road, Boone glanced at him. "Who are you?" The man exhaled through. "Going," Officer Clark stammered, his bravado now completely gone. I was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints." "You had complaints," Matthews cut him off, "about an elderly man sitting quietly in a park, minding his own business." Clark swallowed hard, glancing nervously between Matthews and the two men in front of him. I didn't know who he was." "You didn't need to," Matthews said sharply. "This is a public park. You don't harass people for sitting in public spaces." Raymond, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge of frustration in his tone. "I've been coming to this park for 30 years, Captain," he said, his eyes locked on Clark. "Never had a problem until today." Matthews nodded, his face tight with frustration. "And you shouldn't have had one today. This is not how we do things." He turned to Clark, his voice taking on an edge of finality. "Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later." Clark hesitated for a moment, then nodded stiffly and walked away, his boots dragging across the gravel as he disappeared down the path. The tension in the air seemed to lift with his departure, but it left behind a lingering sense of unease. Matthews turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening. "I apologize for that," he said quietly. "That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Raymond studied the captain for a moment, then gave a small nod. I appreciate that, Captain, but this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it'll be the last. Matthew sighed, the weight of his position heavy on his shoulders. I know, he admitted. Fog as Captain Matthews watched Officer Clark disappear into the distance. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. He wasn't a stranger to situations like this. He had been on the force long enough to know the struggles his community faced. Raymond Matthews began using the older man's first name, now a sign of familiarity. I know this can't fix what just happened, but I want you to know that we're not all like that. Clark. He's new, he's still learning. The words sounded hollow even as he said them. Raymond didn't reply at first. His eyes wandered, taking in the park he had spent so many mornings in, a place that had always brought him peace. Today, though, that peace had been shattered. His hands, now resting on his cane, gripped it tightly. It's always something, he muttered, more to himself than to Matthews. Always something. Kelvin, standing close by, gave a tight nod. It's not just about learning, Captain. It's about understanding, he said. Clark's not just new. He came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. He knew Kelvin was right. Was. Culture within the department, one that had been there long before he ever put on the badge. And it wasn't going to be easy to change. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. I'm not going to make excuses for him, Matthews replied, his tone more resolved now. He'll face consequences for this, I assure you. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training. It won't just be for Clark either. Raymond, still silent, turned to face the captain. Training, huh? He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. You think training is going to change? He looked up at Matthews, his eyes filled with the kind of exhaustion that only a man who had lived through decades of struggle could know. I've seen starts before, Captain, he said softly. I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish. Kelvin watched the exchange closely, his own heart heavy with the reality they were facing. He respected Captain Matthews, had known him for years, even before he rose to his current position. But respect didn't make him blind to the issues that remained unresolved. He placed a hand gently on Raymond's shoulder, offering. Yet restored for a long while, neither man spoke. The distant sounds of joggers and birds filled the air. But it was as though a blanket of silence had fallen over Raymond and Kelvin. Raymond stared down at his hands, the lines in his skin a map of his life's experiences. The park had always been a place where he could escape the pressures of the world. But now it felt different, tainted. I'm getting too old for this, Raymond finally muttered, his voice low and worn. Kelvin, who had been gazing out at the park, turned to look at. Come as far as we think, Kelvin didn't respond right away. He let Raymond's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. He knew the truth of what Raymond was saying. The progress they had fought for was real, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Maybe we haven't, Kelvin said finally. But that doesn't mean we give up. I don't think you've ever been the type to give up, Ray. Raymond gave a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. No, I guess not. But it gets harder, Kelvin. Every year it gets harder, Kelvin. In a nearly empty park was quickly becoming something much larger. By the afternoon, whispers had turned into phone calls, and phone calls into online posts. It wasn't long before the local news picked up the story, and soon enough, a small crowd had gathered at Grant Park. Raymond stayed away from the crowd at first, watching from a distance as people arrived, some carrying signs, others just standing and talking in small groups. It felt surreal. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had come to the park that morning just like any other day, hoping for a little. Peace and quiet now. It seemed that his routine had been upended in a way he hadn't expected. But as he watched, something else stirred inside him. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. And even though he was tired, so tired, he couldn't walk away, Kelvin stood beside him, silent for a while, then nudged Raymond gently. "Looks like people are ready to speak up." Raymond nodded, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. "Yeah, guess they are." The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now. Some of them were familiar faces, neighbors and friends. From the community, but many were strangers, young people, old people, people of different backgrounds and races. They had all come together, united by something that Raymond couldn't help but feel was larger than him, larger than all of them. Someone from the crowd waved at him, and Raymond realized with a start that they were calling for him to come forward. He glanced at Kelvin, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "They want to hear from you, Ray," Kelvin said gently. "They need to hear from you." Raymond hesitated for a moment, but then he straightened up his. How could he have stopped things from unraveling this way? If only I'd paid more attention to them, he thought bitterly. If I hadn't spent so much time trying to prove myself here, maybe they'd still be with me. His eyes burned with unshed tears as guilt consumed him. Work, which usually served as a distraction, now felt impossible. His fingers trembled on the keyboard, and the screen in front of him blurred into an indecipherable mess. When the clock finally struck the end of the workday, Peter exhaled a shaky breath of relief. He began hastily packing up his things, eager to escape the suffocating office and retreat to the solitude of his home. Maybe there, amidst the quiet, he could figure out how to piece his shattered life back together. But before he could leave, Arthur's cold, authoritative voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Peter," he barked, not even bothering to look up from the papers in his hands. "Come to my office. Now." Peter froze, a wave of dread rising up. A full perimeter lockdown. He'd be gone before they even knew which direction to search. The walls loomed ahead, a 10-foot stretch of reinforced stone, topped with razor wire. A guard tower sat to the left, but the spotlight wasn't fixed on this section. Another oversight, another weakness. Castillo had never thought to address. Boone didn't slow. He ran full tilt, boots pounding against the dirt. As he leapt, catching the edge of the wall with both hands, he hauled himself up fast, muscles burning from the exertion, his fingers barely avoiding the cruel bite of the wire. He swung. "Don't belong." He glanced around the group, making eye contact with as many people as he could. There were nods of understanding. Faces tightened with the weight of their own experiences. That young officer, he saw me sitting here and decided I didn't belong. Why? Because I was sitting in a park while black. Raymond shook his head, a wave of anger flashing across his usually calm demeanor. I've seen this too many times. I saw it in the 60s. And now, here we are. Nothing's changed. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of frustration passing through them. They had gathered because this wasn't just about Raymond, it was about all of them, about a system that continued to target their community without reason. Kelvin stepped up beside Raymond, his presence offering quiet support. Raymond paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "We're tired, but we can't stop," Raymond said, his voice growing stronger. "Every time something like this happens, it takes a piece of us, but it also lights a fire. We've been through too much to let this slide. If we let this go, what's stopping them from coming after the next person? Or the one after that?" The crowd's energy was building now, a palpable current of determination running through them. What had begun as a quiet gathering was turning into something more, a movement fueled by the frustrations and hopes of the community. Kelvin took a step forward, addressing the crowd alongside his friend. "We all know what needs to happen. We can't just wait for the system to fix itself. We need to demand that it be fixed. That starts right here, right now. If you want to see change, we've got to be the ones to make it happen." A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with anger. "We've had enough talks. How do we make them listen?" Raymond and Kelvin exchanged a glance. They knew this wasn't going to be easy. Protests, petitions, discussions, these had all been tried before. But they also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. "We've got to show up," Kelvin said, his voice firm. "They need to see that we won't be silent anymore. We demand accountability. We demand better." The crowd began to buzz with conversation, energy crackling through the air. People began to talk about organizing a rally, contacting city officials demanding answers. Some of them had been involved in community organizing before, but others were new to this kind of action, their passion born out of frustration with the system. As the crowd swelled with purpose, Raymond couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had been tired, was still tired, but seeing the faces of the younger generation stepping up to carry the torch gave him a new sense of strength. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Kelvin placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, as if sensing the shift in his. Kelvin had insisted, and Raymond knew deep down that this was bigger than his own discomfort. If his experience could help shed light on the broader issues facing his community, then it was worth it. The day of the rally arrived quickly. Grant Park once again became the gathering point for the community. But this time, the quiet space was filled with hundreds of people. Signs were held high, reading messages like, "Justice for all," "We belong," and "No more silence." The air was thick with purpose and determination. Raymond stood near the front of the crowd, leaning on his, where each partner supports and strengthens the other. The act of creating Eve from Adam's side carries a prophetic symbolism that goes beyond the immediate narrative. The idea of sharing in God's image is central to understanding this symbolism. In Genesis 1:27, it says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." This verse indicates that both men and women are made in the image of God. A profound truth that emphasizes equality and dignity for all people. By creating woman from man's side, God. Against the wooden stage, with each step he paused for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him. And then he began to speak. I've been here before, Raymond said, his voice carrying across the park. I've stood in front of crowds just like this, fighting for the same things we're fighting for today. And I'll be honest with you, it's exhausting. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. But Raymond wasn't finished. But we can't stop, he continued. We can't let our exhaustion silence us, because if we do, nothing changes. And I don't know. With respect, with dignity, and if we don't demand it, then who will? So I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, don't let this moment pass by. Don't let this be just another rally, just another day. Let this be the start of something real. The applause grew louder, and for a moment, Raymond felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He wasn't done fighting, not yet. As the rally came to an end, the organizers began discussing the next steps. They weren't going to let the momentum die down. Kelvin, Raymond, and the rest of the core group made plans to meet with city officials, pushing for tangible change in police training and community engagement. Captain Matthews had been watching from the edge of the crowd, taking in everything with a serious expression. He had come to the rally not just as an observer, but as a supporter. After the incident with Officer Clark, he knew his department needed to take immediate and meaningful steps to address the issues that had been ignored for far too long. When the crowd began to disperse, Matthews made his way over to Raymond and Kelvin, his face set with symbolic gesture, a small step toward rebuilding the trust that had been eroded over the years. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, discussions, and a renewed sense of purpose within the community. Raymond continued to speak out, both at local events and in private meetings with city officials. He had become an unexpected voice of the movement, a role he hadn't sought out but had embraced nonetheless. Kelvin, too, was deeply involved, working alongside organizers to push for concrete changes in police policies. Weren't going to settle for half. Voice, Anita said, her voice growing a bit stronger. I didn't think people like me would be heard. But you and Mr. Kelvin, you've been doing this for so long, and now it feels like maybe things can change. Raymond smiled, though it was a tired smile, the kind of smile that comes from a lifetime of knowing how hard it was to get people to really listen. It's not just me, he said. It's all of us. You're part of this too. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones. Anita looked down, clearly moved by his. Happening here, he said, and the people this gang hurt will finally see justice. Zane and Travis nodded, the weight of their mission sinking in as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The three men slipped away into the shadows, leaving the scene behind. They had done their part, and now it was time to let the system do its job. But Jamal couldn't shake the lingering thought. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as Jamal sat. The happening here, he said, and the people this gang hurt will finally see justice. Zane and Travis nodded, the weight of their mission sinking in as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as Jamal sat and set into the shadows, leaving the scene behind. They had done their part, and now it was time to let the system do its job. But Jamal couldn't shake the lingering thought, this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. of a much larger battle. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as Jamal sat and set into the shadows, leaving the scene behind. They had done their part, and now it was time to let the system do its job. But Jamal couldn't shake the lingering thought, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as Jamal sat and set into the shadows, leaving the scene behind. They had done their part, and now it was time to let the system do its job. But Jamal couldn't shake the lingering thought, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger battle. That she didn't need to have all the answers to be part of something bigger than herself. "I want to help," she said, after a long pause, "but I don't know where to start." Raymond chuckled softly. "No one knows where to start. We all just figure it out along the way." Meanwhile, across town, Kelvin had been hard at work with the core group of community leaders, hammering out details for their next major step. A public forum with city officials, police representatives, and concerned citizens. They wanted transparency, real accountability. They wanted to make sure that the promises when systemic racism, segregation, and violence against Black Americans further magnified the image of Black Jesus, preachers in Black churches emphasized Jesus' humanity in his alignment with the downtrodden, portraying him as a figure who shared the daily struggles of Black life. Gospel songs like "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands" and "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" offered solace and strength, affirming that Jesus walked alongside those enduring the trials and tribulations of a racially divided society. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century elevated the concept of Black Jesus as a powerful symbol of justice. Hold officers accountable. We can't police ourselves if the community doesn't trust us. This board will ensure that there is transparency. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, this time in support. People were skeptical, but the idea of having real oversight, a system where they could directly hold officers responsible, was something they hadn't expected to hear. Raymond, sitting near the front with Kelvin, exchanged a glance with him. "That's more than I thought they'd offer," he whispered. Kelvin nodded. "It's a start." But the night wasn't over. More hands went up. Questions were asked. People shared their more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. Genesis 3:1. The serpent approached Eve and began to question God's command, sowing seeds of doubt. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? Eve responded, clarifying that they could eat from any tree except that one, lest you die. Genesis 32:3. But the serpent was persuasive, insisting, "You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Genesis 3:4-5 here. Man who knew that the system he worked in was flawed and was finally ready to admit it. Or maybe it was the crowd, the people who had come together, not just to demand answers, but to take part in finding those answers. As the night drew to a close, Raymond and Kelvin walked out of the auditorium together, the crisp night air wrapping around them. They didn't speak for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Raymond broke the silence. "You think this will really change anything?" Kelvin glanced at him, his face serious. "But hopeful. I think it's a start. Ray, I really do." Raymond nodded slowly, his mind still turning over everything he had heard. That night, he had spent so much of his life fighting for change, for progress. And there were moments, like tonight, when he wondered if it was all worth it. But then he remembered the faces of the people in the crowd, the voices of the young people who were standing up and demanding to be heard. And he knew, deep down, that it was worth it. It had to be. In the weeks that followed the forum, Civilian Oversight Board was established, and it didn't take long for the community to get involved. People from all walks of life signed up to be a part of the board to help oversee the changes being implemented in the police department. Raymond found himself more involved than he had expected. He had thought the forum would be the end of his public role, that he'd be able to step back and let the younger generation take over. But his phone kept ringing, and every time Kelvin or one of the other organisers called, he couldn't say no. "You've." Supplies she gave him a knowing smile as she climbed the steps. "Figured you'd start fixing this place up today." Jamal nodded, setting the toolbox down. "It's long overdue. I can't keep looking at it like this." Lena placed the bag on the porch, her voice softening. "You've been through a lot, Jamal. You don't have to do this alone." "I know," he said, glancing at her, "that this is something I need to do." Lena didn't press further, instead opening the bag to reveal paint cans, brushes, and a few replacement boards for the siding. "Well, lucky for you." The day it had all begun, that moment with Officer Clark, had been just one in a long line of similar moments throughout his life. But this time, something had changed. The community had rallied, and for once it felt like their voices were being heard. Anita appeared again, her familiar green hoodie blending into the background of the park as she approached. She smiled shyly as she sat beside him, the same spot she had taken weeks earlier. "You're becoming a regular," Raymond teased, his eyes twinkling with warmth. Anita laughed softly, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I am." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them watching the world go by. There was peace here, a kind of peace that Raymond hadn't felt in a long time. And it wasn't just because the park was quiet. It was because for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. "I think I'm ready," Anita said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Raymond turned to her, a curious look on his face. "Ready for what? To speak up? she said. To really be a part of this, I've been.